Who stays? Who goes? Let's predict the Falcons' 53-man roster.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And guys, if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka the Jolly Green Giant, aka Mr. aka, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, podcasting for over a decade, still going strong here on Locked On Falcons podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me. As everydayers, that means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So today we are breaking down the 53-man roster. We'll be looking at offense, defense, special teams, the guys I think will be on this 53-man roster, plus 16 dart throws in terms of the practice squad. But one of the things I always pride myself on, 2.5 months ahead of training camp, is be able to predict that 53-man roster with 90% accuracy, in part due to, my immaculate ability to build a 48-man roster. That's going to be the guys that you're going to be playing with each and every week. And then you go from there. And, you do the math on the 48-man. It's like 2 quarterbacks, 8 offensive linemen, 11 offensive skill players, 9 DBs, 14 front 7 players, 3 special teamers, and then like 1 other guy left over, depending on where you need some help due to injuries and other various things and whatnot, special teams and all that stuff. So always a good time to sort of look ahead to this Falcons roster and some of these key training camp battles as we sit here, more than 2 months ahead of training camp. But we'll start off with the offense. We'll get to the defense and special teams, and then we'll talk about some of those remaining holes that we could see the Falcons wind up addressing between now and the start of training camp. But without further ado, let's get into that 53-man roster projection for the offense. I have the Falcons keeping 3 quarterbacks, Michael Penix, Kirk Cousins, and of course, 4-time national champion Easton Stick, the Stetson Bennett of the FCS. Yes, Kirk Cousins will be here in Atlanta. I do not see a trade happening, as I've maintained since January. And so, got to die on this hill at this point and continue dying on that hill. 3 running backs making the Falcons roster: Bijan Robinson, Tyler Algier, Jace McClellan. 6 wide receivers: in Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Ray McLeod, Kadero Hodge, Jamal Agnew, and Casey Washington. 3 tight ends: in Kyle Pitts, Charlie Warner, and Felipe Franks, the incomparable Felipe Franks. And 9 offensive linemen: Jake Matthews, Matthew Bergeron, Ryan Uzel, Chris Lindstrom, Kayla McGarry, Storm Norton, Kyle Hinton, Jovan Gwen, and the incomparable Jack Nelson. I cannot wait, guys, that we get to Jack Nelson week here on this podcast sometime in June. I will continue to hype it up and build it up as the greatest week of podcasting that you will ever see. So 24 players for me on the Falcons roster, and then 8 more on the practice squad, 24 on the Falcons offensive roster, I should say. 8 more on the practice squad, 1 running back in Carlos Washington Jr., 3 wide receivers in Nick Nash, Chris Blair, and David Sills, 1 tight end in Joshua Simon, 3 offensive linemen in Killian Zier, Joshua Gray, and Joey Fisher. Again, all these practice squads are basically dart throws. It's just going to basically be on who of these rookies and undrafted free agents and former practice squad guys sort of pop in training camp. But I think the most notable battles when we look at the offensive side of the ball are going to be at sort of 3 position groups, 4 roster spots, right? Wide receiver 6, tight end 3, and then offensive lineman 8 and 9, right? That's potentially the backup center spot that I have Javon Gwynn winning. And that's the 4th offensive tackle spot that, of course, no one can unseat the incomparable Jack Nelson for that roster spot, but there will be challengers as well. And so, wide receiver 6, I have Casey Washington making the team mostly because of special teams value. Tight end 3, I have Felipe Franks making it as that 3rd tight end, mostly because of special teams value. But there's going to be opportunities for some of these UDFAs, especially that are getting a lot of buzz so far, to potentially, unseat some of these more veteran options, some of these more established options in these spots. Like you look at that wide receiver spot with Nick Nash. Nick Nash is basically a poor man's Drake London. Now, for me personally, that skill set isn't that intriguing because, like, why do I want a poor man's Drake London when I already have Drake London? But certainly I think if you're, potentially looking at options for the Falcons in that slot outside of Drake London, who we know is clearly by far the best slot receiver on the football team. But of course, because of circumstances, will primarily continue to be lining up as an outside, or at least 50-50 split in terms of outside inside versatility. Nick Nash does have some developmental potential. Again, to me, the ideal wide receiver that the Falcons would be developing in the wide receiver 6 spot is someone who has a little bit more verticality, a little bit more yak ability, that sort of matches a little bit better with Drake London and Darnell Mooney's skill set. Guy that can be a little bit more of a vertical threat than Drake London. We know Drake London can win down the field as a contested guy, but wanting a little bit more speed at that position, as well as a guy that can win after the catch and bring a little bit more juice in terms of that ability. You just sort of look at Puka Nacua and what he does with the Rams is the ideal skill set. And Drake London is kind of bridging that Nacua skill set with the Cooper Kupp skill set. And so, again, that's what you're ideally looking for. Nick Nash isn't really that guy to me, but certainly offers some potential upside and developmental upside as a slot receiver. That backup center spot, Jovan Gwynn, Joshua Gray, I think, is a guy that's getting a lot of love potentially there. The reason why I went with Jovan Gwynn is just the lack of experience that Joshua Gray has playing center. He spent 4 years playing left tackle in college, 1 year playing guard, did work at the Shrine Bowl practices as a center. And so there is some ability there. But I just think, when you're looking at it from the Falcons' perspective, in the event that Ryan Nuzul goes down with an injury, you want somebody who has like 3 years of experience playing center, like Jovan Gwynn will have by the time we get to the end of the summer, versus someone who has basically 3 months of center experience, which is going to be Joshua Gray at that point in time. But the tight end 3 spot, I think, is interesting with Joshua Simon, where that skill set, that value for this Falcons team, when we look at what Ross Dwelley did in that role last year, was primarily a blocker and special teams contributor. Those aren't things that Joshua Simon is particularly known for. He does have a good receiving skill set, particularly when it comes to being that underneath pass catcher and winning after the catch. But I think that's why guys like Felipe Franks, who's, was the leading special teams tackler for the Panthers last year, someone like Tegan Quitoriano, who was a decent blocker for the Texans over the last couple of years, those guys get the edge. And not to mention, Nikola Kinlinich, who, also has some experience playing in this Rams offense, in LA so some knowledge of this offense under Zach Robinson, I think gives those guys a leg up in terms of making the roster. But I think Simon certainly is an intriguing skill set, again, developmental in terms of what he could be down the road as a pass catcher, particularly given, as we sit here today, it seems like it's going to be Kyle Pitts' last year in Atlanta. So we'll see how that develops, and sort of having a guy that, if Simon can really ball out this summer and showcase that pass catching ability, that could change the math for these guys. But I don't have undrafted free agents making the Falcons 53-man roster. All of these guys could if they come in and ball out this summer. But I think when we look at the Falcons offense, and it's a little bit of a different story with the defense, slightly different story, but the Falcons offense, I think because they expect this offense to be sort of the breadwinner for this football team in terms of the thing that's going to help them win the majority of football games, I do think going with some more established, proven options in some of these spots than, going with some of these rookies, particularly in the undrafted free agent group, makes a little bit more sense, just because you're going to need guys that are going to be able to contribute, if and when they get those opportunities due to injuries or whatnot. And it's not as if like the Falcons aren't young already on the offense, where like 7 other top 13 guys on offense are on rookie deals and whatnot. And so the expectation to me is that core is going to continue to grow in the years to come for the Falcons. That's their vision, I think, as opposed to like, oh, we got to get more young body, more young talent in here and whatnot. Like, that's, to me, more something for the future. But we'll see on that front. It's a little bit of a different story with the Falcons defense, where they are much younger on that side of the ball. And how does that impact some of these roster battles that we're going to get into? And we'll break all of that, guys, down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So the NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's the game-winning shot or a breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on the action. And FanDuel's making it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live during the game with player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays. Fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. And I'm excited for this next round of playoffs where I know we're supposed to be Eastern Conference focus here on Locked On's Atlanta, Locked On Falcons, Locked On Hawks, all that stuff. Keep it in the family, but I'm looking out west. I'm looking at that Warriors Wolves matchup. I'm thinking, I gotta ride for my guy Ant, right? Anthony Edwards, and then I gotta root against, to me the most overrated player in NBA history is Draymond Green, right? And so I gotta go Wolves in 6, right? And those odds are available over at FanDuel, and you can predict the exact outcome, right? If Minnesota takes the first 2, Golden State then ties it up, and then the Wolves bring it home in 6 games. There's 18-1 odds for that exact outcome. And so those are the beautiful ways that you can bet over at FanDuel. And if you're new to FanDuel, it's a perfect time to sign up. Head on over to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. And if you win that first $5 bet, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. So make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So let's look at the defensive side of the ball and project this 53-man roster. And because I had 24 offensive players, I have 26 defensive players projected to make the roster, and of course 3 special teams players. But starting with the defensive line, defensive tackle room, I got 5 in David Onyemata, Morgan Fox, Ruka Roro, Brandon Dorlus, and Kentavious Street, and then 6 edge rushers, right? We're moving Zach Harrison back to edge, according to Nate Ollie. So we got 6 edge rushers making the team. That's Leonard Floyd, Arnold Ebiketie, Jalen Walker, James Pierce Jr., Braylon Trice, and of course, Zach Harrison. And then we have 5 linebackers, Caden Ellis, Divine Diablo, Troy Anderson, J.D. Bertrand, and Josh Woods. And then we have 5 corners with A.J. Terrell, Mike Hughes, Clark Phillips, Mike Ford, and Natron Brooks. And then 5 safeties, Jesse Bates, Jordan Fuller, DeMarco Helms, Xavier Watts, and Billy Bowman Jr. And you can't see it on the graphics on the depth chart I've thrown up on the screen, but the 3 special teams players are what you expect: Younghoe Koo, Bradley Pinion, and Liam McCullough. Now, as far as the practice squad is concerned, I have 7 defensive players on the practice squad. Defensive lineman LaKale London, edge rusher Khalid Kareem, linebacker Malik Verdon, 3 corners in Keith Taylor, Dante Manning, and Kobe Bryant, and 1 safety in Benny Sapp. And of course, that last practice squad spot goes to the German sensation, Lenny Krieg Jr. I don't know if he's a junior or not, but since Falcons are adding so many juniors to the roster and everybody's just adding junior and senior to their names now, Kyle Pitts Sr. and whatnot, might as well just start calling everybody a junior and senior at this point, the 4th and the 3rd, and everybody's a Trey and all that stuff. So those are the 26 defensive players I have, plus the 3 special teamers and the 8 practice squad guys on that side of the ball. And again, the biggest competitions, I think, there's going to be a lot more competition, I think, across the group for the defensive side of the ball. You have that 5th defensive lineman right now where I have Kentavious Street winning that spot, but I think Taquan Graham and LaKale London are very strong candidates for that. If you're wondering why I didn't have Taquan Graham making the practice squad, just because I assume if the Falcons do cut Taquan Graham, someone will scoop him up off of waivers and he'll be playing for somebody else this year. Obviously, one question mark that I know a lot of people have is whether or not David Onyemata is going to be on this team by the time we get to training camp. And, it's a possibility. Again, it's been something that we've been speculating since January that David Onyemata had played his last snap in Atlanta. So far, the Falcons seem to be keeping him. Basically, it seems like, especially if they're going to move Zach Harrison out to edge and, potentially have Brandon Dorlus dabble as an inside-outside guy as well, that having another more proven body, particularly, someone that, is a little bit more proven, I guess, than the youth group that they have at D-tackle makes a little bit sense. So I'm starting to basically believe, I guess, that he's still on the roster on May 5th and seems like he's still going to be on the roster on August 5th and then September 5th and so on and so forth when it comes to David Onyemata at this point in time. So I think that D-line, that back-end D-line spot is going to be a very intriguing battle, whether it's Street, Graham, London, or somebody else. Linebacker 5, that 5th spot at the linebacker position, which is going to be between Josh Woods and D'Angelo Malone. If you noticed on the depth chart, I had D'Angelo Malone listed as a Sam linebacker, as the quote-unquote backup to Troy Anderson in that. And my projection for the depth chart was looking at the Falcons as a 4-3 team, as opposed to what we have been assuming all this time which is more of a 3-4 team. And so I think that will be an interesting battle where the Falcons, and the reason why D'Angelo Malone is not on my practice squad is because of his special teams value. If he gets cut, he'll probably get scooped up by somebody else out there and whatnot. And then, you have the 4th and 5th cornerback spot where I think there are 3 locks at cornerback. There's AJ Terrell, Mike Hughes, Mike Ford being that 3rd lock due to his special teams value and being a gunner on the punt team. And then I think because Billy Bowman is expected to dabble as a nickel corner, I think the Falcons can afford to not keep, more than 5 corners. Right? Normally they would keep 6 on the roster, but because Billy Bowman sort of can, function as both a backup and depth piece at safety and corner, given their expectations for them, they only keep 5 corners. And that competition for those last 2 cornerback spots, based off of my projection, is going to be potentially one of the more intense battles and one of the bigger talking points that we're going to have when we get to training camp between Clark Phillips, D. Alford, Natron Brooks, Kobe Bryant, Kevin King, Keith Taylor. All of those guys are going to be in the mix. I have Phillips and Brooks making the roster. Phillips just because I think the Falcons still want to get something out of the 4th round draft pick from 2 years ago, as well as Brooks being a guy that just because he has that more proven special teams background, and so he'll be able to find a role on this team even if he isn't necessarily an elite cornerback in that. And that gets to the other competition before we turn our attention to Kobe Bryant and the undrafted free agents is, of course, the kicker spot. I have Younghoe Koo winning that spot. We'll see. Again, decent chance that Lenny Krieg can, unseat Younghoe Koo. So we'll see on that front. But, let's talk about Kobe Bryant in that cornerback competition. For me, I'm a fan of Kobe Bryant. I see him projecting more as a nickel. And just because I think there's so many other options that the Falcons currently have on their roster at nickel cornerback is why I'm not projecting a guy like Kobe Bryant as an undrafted free agent to make the Falcons 53-man roster, because you have D. Alford coming back. You have Clark Phillips coming back. You have Natron Brooks, who has some experience playing at nickel. And when we think about Natron Brooks, while he spent the bulk of his time during last summer playing outside corner, when we got to the regular season, he spent the bulk of his time playing that slot cornerback role. And when we talk about what you value in a nickel cornerback, we like that guy that's willing to stick his face in the fan. That's why the Falcons like a guy like Billy Bowman in that role. And the other guy on this roster that we saw throughout the preseason last year that is more than willing to stick his face in the fan is Natron Brooks. And Kobe Bryant has that same skill set, but I just don't know if that's going to be enough for Kobe Bryant, coupled with some of these guys that are a little bit more inside-outside more proven inside-outside versatility at the NFL level, for him to unseat those guys. Now, I know Kobe Bryant spent the bulk of his time playing as an outside corner in college, but I just don't think Kobe Bryant has the athleticism to hold up long-term in that role. And so if he's going to make it in this league, I think he's going to have to make it as a nickel cornerback. And just because I think the Falcons have enough bodies there, that's one of the reasons why I'm not projecting Kobe Bryant to make the 53-man roster, but I do have him on the practice squad. And so it's going to be interesting competition for these back end roster spots on the defensive side of the ball. As we discussed with the offense, they are a young core of offensive players, but they're really betting on a lot of young pieces to contribute this year on the defensive side of the ball. That when, we'll talk about this a little bit later when we look back at last year, where one of the things that we talked about, sort of the complacency of the Falcons, where they believed that they were like 75% built the playoff team and only really focus on adding the 25% of players missing on both sides of the ball last offseason to push them over the top. There's going to be a lot more turnover this year on particularly the defensive side of the ball. And so we'll get into that a little bit as we continue and wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. But that's a great conversation, jumping off point to get into where we want to talk about next, which is where the Falcons could use more help on their roster. That they feel mostly content, but are there moves coming potentially between now and the start of training camp? And we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So say goodbye to sticky notes, scribbled plans on the fridge, and overlapping calendar invites, because Skylight Calendar is here to bring clarity to the chaos and help families stay organized without the stress. The sleek digital display syncs with your existing calendars, whether that's Google, Apple, Outlook, and more, And it's going to make it simple to track appointments, practices, dinners, and reminders all in one easy to see place. And for me, I know if I don't put something in my calendar, I will completely forget about that. And that's pretty bad when you're trying to line up guests for podcasts over the course of the summer. So whether you're like me and you can tend to be forgetful if it's not in your calendar, or you're just looking to get more organized and get kids to all their activities, or just figuring out when's the next best night for your date night, check out Skylight Calendar, and it's just in time for Mother's Day. Right now, Skylight is offering our listeners $30 off their 15-inch calendars by going to skylightcal.com/locked/NFL. Go to skylightcal.com/NFL for $30 off your 15-inch calendar. That's skylightcal.com/NFL. So if you're asking me, where do the Falcons need the most help on the roster? Well, my answer to that question is everywhere, right? If it was up to me, like they need to improve their roster, right? Their roster is good enough, right? I don't know if they have a good roster, but it's good enough, right? That, I would probably, it'll be interesting to see once we get into the next couple of weeks, over the next month or so, when all these various, ESPNs and NFL networks, and they do their roster rankings and their position rankings and all that, where the Falcons wind up in there. I remember last year I was like, yeah, they're like the 18th best roster in the NFL. And again, that's good enough that if the coaches are doing their thing, they should be able to get to 9 wins. And that's the bet that the coaches are making on themselves. But I remember last year, a lot of people were telling the folks, that, this is one of the 10 best rosters in football. And I was like, what are you guys talking about? Like, what was that? And again, I'm not sitting here to dunk on the Falcons, but it's just one of those things that those people, and then we get to the end of the season, we're like, man, we need like 7 or 8 new starters on defense. And it's like, yeah, man, if you were a top 10 roster, you wouldn't need that many, upgrades on either side of the ball. But, going back to what I said earlier, where we talk about, the turnover for this Falcons roster. Right, last year we had 75% of the Falcons' top 16 players on either side of the ball, offense and defense, based off of how many snaps those guys, the top 16 snap getters, were new faces, right? And so, or 75% were players that were on the team the previous year, 25% were new faces. Now it wound up being a little bit higher than 25% on offense just because of Michael Penix, but those 4 players of the top 16 were Kirk Cousins, Darnell Mooney, Ray-Ray McCloud, Charlie Warner, and then Michael Penix by year's end. And then on defense, it was a similar story with Matthew Judon, Justin Simmons, Eddie Goldman, and James Smith-Williams being the new faces. And when we sort of project out, it's like the top 16 players on offense this year in terms of, again, we don't know what injuries are going to do and affect that, but you're not really looking at any new players on offense this year. You are looking at expanded roles for guys like Ryan Nuzzo and Michael Penix, right? Do we see more of Jace McClellan as RB3? Do we see more of whoever winds up winning the tight end 3 spot due to various injuries or whatnot? Or, Lord knows, could Zach Robinson use that third tight end like a fullback, or, actually run some 13 personnel more than like 1% of the time? Like, oh, that would be an interesting wrinkle for Zach. But, more on that in the coming months when we talk about all the interesting wrinkles that Zach Robinson is going to unveil. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. But we'll see a lot more new friends, if DJ Khaled, could be quoted, right? New friends on offense, but lots of new friends on defense because of the additions of free agents like Leonard Floyd and Divine Diablo and Morgan Fox and Jordan Fuller. And you got rookies like Billy Bowman and Xavier Watts and Jalen Walker and James Pierce. And then you got second-year players like Brandon Dorless and Ruka Roro, J.D. Bertrand, Braylon Trice. Again, guys that were here last year, but certainly were not big parts of playing time. We really got no snaps. And so, like, you could see a situation where if we're looking at the top 16 players on defense, like 50% of those players are new, roughly 50% of those players are new, right? And then you're only looking at a situation where it's only 25% of the players that were top 16 players last year or top 16 players this year. And that's like Caden Ellis and Jesse Bates and, AJ Terrell and Arnold Bichetti and David Onyemata, if you believe he's going to be around. So, there is a world where like we have complete turnover on the defense, and it's understandable because it's like, this unit needs a spark, unlike the offense, right? So when we think about that, what does that mean? How does that inform us when it comes to how the Falcons think about the roster? And I think when we look at it from the team's perspective, I think there's two positions that you circle that you're like, I wonder if the Falcons will make a move there. Center and nose tackle have been those positions that we've talked about a bunch over the last couple of weeks and last couple of months. To me, the Falcons have not prioritized competition at that center spot. They seem to be a lot higher on Ryan Nusel and his ability to perform as a starter than the rest of the world seems to be, myself included. Maybe we get a signing before training camp, but I tend to be skeptical of that because, again, if the Falcons thought that they needed to bring in competition, March was the perfect time. There were plenty of options, veteran options out there available for them. They chose not to do that. They chose not to draft a center, right? Like a lot of people thought they would. So all indicators are like the Falcons are very content with Ryan Nusel. Again, whether you and I are very content with Ryan Nusel is a different conversation, but the Falcons are very content. But again, there's a possibility that, we get to July or whatever, and the Falcons are like, you know what, let's get that veteran, if they are going to bring in someone like a David Andrews, whose name gets thrown around a lot, like you're probably not going to bring in David Andrews today. You might wait till July because David Andrews has to figure out if he's going to retire or not, if he gets that itch to come back and play and be like, I want to play for my hometown or my home state team in the Atlanta Falcons. So that may happen. I'm skeptical of that at this point in time, but we'll see. Nose tackle, we've been talking about needing more of that wide body run plugger. But again, as we've mentioned briefly before on the podcast, and we'll probably wind up discussing a lot more, in the coming days and weeks on the podcast when we talk about the defensive scheme. If you're going to major in that Jets wide 9 defense that Jeff Ulbrich called with the Jets the last 4 years, that scheme doesn't really utilize a one technique nose tackle like most 4-3 teams and most 3-4 teams do nowadays with these hybrid fronts that want that sort of wide body nose tackle, whether you're in the 3-4, whether you're in the 4-3, whatnot. And so the fact that the Falcons have seemingly shown no interest in that is another strong indicator that that's the direction that they plan on going in terms of their defensive front. And so we'll just sort of have to see. But that to me is the one area where I do think the Falcons can definitely afford to get better at, just to get more beef in the middle of the defensive line to help stop the run. But we'll see on that front. So, I think if the Falcons are going to, make additions to their roster between now and training camp, I do think that D-line room makes more sense. You look at how many players that the Falcons carried along the D-line and edge rushers going into training camp last year. That was 20. Right now they sit at 17, right? So there's still more opportunities to bring in 1 or 2 more, if not 3 more bodies there. And then one of the things I think you should be on the lookout for, we'll get the rookie mini camp, this weekend. And usually the Falcons pretty consistently under Terry Fontenot will sort of reshuffle their roster. They'll cut, they'll bring in some tryout guys. They'll sign 1 or 2 of those guys that stand out in that initial tryouts and maybe cut, a UDFA here, a futures contract guy they signed back in January here or there. So there is usually some roster reshuffling in mid-May after that rookie minicamp, which begins, I believe, May 9th and finishes on May 11th. So we'll see on that front. And, some areas where you could see the Falcons sort of trim down their roster a little bit. Wide receivers 1, again, because they carried 12 into training camp last year. They currently have 14 on the roster right now. Offensive line, they have they carried only 15 last year. They're currently carrying 17. That includes Ryan Nusel, who technically has not signed his restricted free agent tender. I know there's been some confusion about like Ryan Nusel hasn't signed his contract. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. Ryan Nusel is a restricted free agent. The opportunity for him to change teams passed like 2 weeks ago. A week before, the Thursday before the draft was the final deadline. And really his not signing the contract is functionally meaningless. It just means he hasn't actually inked his deal. And that basically means that the Falcons technically are saving $3 million against the salary cap because he hasn't signed his contract. And so that to me is the main reason why you haven't seen that happen. It's just, it gives the Falcons a little bit more cap space until they're ready to sign all the rookies and sign Ryan Nusel, which will probably happen in the coming days and weeks. So that will be something to look forward to. So we'll see on that front. So there's a couple of, roster reshuffling in terms of what the Falcons could wind up doing, I think, between now and training camp. But I'm not currently expecting any major moves. If they are going to bring in an established player that may be a nose tackle, a Foley Fatukasi, who played for Nate Ollie, in a couple of spots. Houston last year, the Jets 4 years ago. And so he makes a ton of sense if the Falcons are just going to get that wide body nose tackle. But outside of that, again, if David Andrews basically gives the Falcons a call and say, hey, I'm ready to come back and I want to come in and compete for the job, maybe then I think the Falcons bring in a veteran center. But if not, then I think they're pretty much close to having the core of their 90-man roster heading into training camp. And so we'll see if they reshuffle some back end guys, bring in some tryout guys and whatnot. Who was the player? Wasn't it Bradley Anai, I think, was one of those players that they tried out last summer and brought to training camp. So those types of moves, I think, make sense for the Falcons. So we'll see what they wind up doing. But tomorrow's episode, I think we will be joined by Derek Klassen of The Athletic to talk about his thoughts on the Falcons draft, as well as his thoughts on Michael Penix Jr. and his breakout potential this upcoming season. So that is all in store for you guys on the next Locked On Falcons. Continue to make us your first listen by subscribing or following free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, check out all the great shows across the Locked On Podcast Network as your second listen, including the Locked On NFL Scouting Show, breaking down the post-draft stuff, breaking down teams that have remaining roster holes. Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino giving you the scoop on how to build an effective roster on the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast. And it's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Go Wolves.